I'm going to speak for the next sort of 25 to 35 minutes or so about something that's really, really important when thinking about applying for funding, specifically from NIHR, but from other health and social care research funders as well. And that is patient and public involvement, or working with people and communities. You may or may not have heard of PPI, patient and public involvement, before. The terminology does seem to be shifting within the NIHR context to working with people and communities. But just to sort of say at this point, to all intents and purposes, they do mean the same thing, and I'll probably kind of go back and forth between these two ways of describing patient and public involvement throughout the course of the presentation. But they do mean the same thing. So my name is Megan Barlow-Pay. I'm the Public Involvement Lead for the Research Support Service and Specialist Centre for Public Health based here in Southampton. My colleague Lien wrote part of this presentation. She's actually not with me today. She's in Vietnam, which is very nice for her. So I'll be running through the whole thing. Okay, so what we'll be talking about in this presentation is a kind of an overview and setting out the principles of what we mean by patient and public involvement, or people and communities, and kind of understanding a little bit more about why it's important and why NIHR and other funders require it and want applicants to ensure that they're doing meaningful people work, PPI. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit more through some of the practicalities and some of the logistics of how you would actually go about starting patient and public involvement work, how you would think about planning that into a grant application, how you would cost it, and things like that. So if we just start with talking about what we mean by patient and public involvement. So the broadly used definition is that patient and public involvement in research is defined as research being carried out with or by members of the public, rather than to, about, or for them. And by that, we mean working in partnership with members of the public. So it is different to what we might term engagement, where we go out into community spaces, for example, and disseminate information about research that's been done. That's quite a passive role for members of the public. They're sort of receiving information, or through newsletters or news channels, whatever that might be. And it's different to participation as well. I'll talk about that in a moment. It's very much about an active collaboration between people with lived experience of a condition or of a service that you're looking at, and the research team to improve and refine that research. Some examples, and this is by no means exhaustive, there's a huge number of ways in which people can be really meaningfully involved, but some examples include things like helping to set research priorities, so ensuring that the outcomes that you're looking at are actually relevant to people that are living with the condition, that are relevant to the population who would ultimately be affected by the research that you're doing. Providing advice on research design. So that's a really important one from a kind of practical point of view, particularly if you're looking to recruit participants in your study. You want to have a really clear idea as to what the barriers to recruitment may be, and how you then mitigate those, and how you think about ensuring you're delivering your research in an accessible and approachable, acceptable way for participants. They can do things like contribute to the development of any kind of patient-facing information, so patient information sheets, consent forms, things like that. They can help with plain English summaries. They could also help with dissemination resources. So when you get to the stage of sharing the results of your research, if it's going out into any kind of public-facing spaces, which it should be, ensuring that you work in collaboration with your patient representatives to make sure that that's clear and understandable and is getting across the messages that you want to be getting across. Another thing they can do is join project advisory or steering group meetings, so having a role essentially at a sort of strategic level or a management level, ensuring that patient perspective is embedded at a more senior level. So as I mentioned earlier, patient and public involvement representatives are not research participants, so it really is about working in partnership. Think of your PPI members as members of the research team. They're there to advise you, they're there to guide you, they're there to take on responsibilities and deliver on elements of the work potentially. They're not there for, to provide you with data and answers to your research question. Patient and public involvement can can mean a kind of a wide range of different individuals depending on what your topic is, and you'll need to think really carefully about who are the right people for you to be talking to. But generally speaking, we mean people who are patients or potential patients, people who are perhaps carers. So, for example, if your work is around a device, for example, to support people living with dementia, you may wish to involve carers of those individuals to get their perspectives and get their insights, because they'll be heavily involved in the care of those particular patients. Generally, people who use health and social care services. Also, patient public representatives can include people from organisations, say charities, who represent or kind of who kind of are advocates for patient groups. So in terms of why patient and public involvement matters, so there's a kind of core ethical principle that, particularly with NIHR, which is publicly funded money, it's important that it is spent in a way that brings value to the population, and it allows that process to become more democratic and brings an element of accountability and responsibility there. It also ensures that there's diverse perspectives embedded throughout the design and delivery of research, which can be really important in terms of ensuring that research is designed and delivered in a way that answers questions for the broader population, and that can help counter research reinforcing health inequalities and things like that. It can improve research quality, so it improves research quality quite significantly, and there's been studies around things like recruitment and retention rates and the impact that patient and public involvement can have in the kind of delivery of the research, and ensuring that it is, this is one of the things that we know as researchers are really challenging, kind of recruiting patients and retaining them once they're in the study. So if we can make that as accessible and as easy as possible for people, then that is absolutely going to be a good thing. It improves the relevance and therefore the impact. So it really does help us to ensure that the research that we're doing is relevant to the people that should be benefiting from it. And for all of these reasons, it is a really clear kind of priority for a huge number of funders, including NIHR. So ensuring that you have really good PPI within your grant application aligns with these priorities. So I mentioned earlier, you'll need to think carefully about who exactly your patient and public involvement representatives are. And it will vary significantly from project to project. It will depend on kind of who your participant population are potentially, who your long-term beneficiaries of your research might be. These are conversations that you'll need to have within your team, have with the RSS PPI team if you're linking in with us. But as I mentioned a minute ago, your population or your people and communities that you want to be reaching out to are going to be end users, carers, general population, people who represent your research participants. Ultimately, it needs to be people who are going to have some insight and some perspective on what it would be like to take part in your research or to benefit from your research ultimately. It is really important to consider diverse perspectives. So, patient and public involvement will never be representative. We don't take a kind of methodological sampling approach like we might do in qualitative research. But that doesn't mean that you can't be really careful about how you consider capturing diverse perspectives in your patient and public involvement group. And it's really important that barriers from different kind of people with different social positions, people with different cultural backgrounds and things like that might be different. And in order for research to be appropriate and to be suitable and to give us the answers that we need for a diverse population, we need to be getting perspectives from all of those different people. In terms of an NIHR definition of patient and public involvement, some groups are not considered PPI, and specifically healthcare workers. And there's often some question marks around this, particularly if research is done in a healthcare setting and answering questions about healthcare workers' environments and things like that, for example. In those kind of studies, involvement of healthcare workers is still really important and will answer really valuable questions, but it would be considered wider stakeholder involvement and it wouldn't be considered PPI. So that's just something to be mindful of. Okay, so in terms of some of the practicalities of patient and public involvement, one of the first things that you're going to need to think about, and this is in the grant development stage, so the stage that we're talking about today when you're thinking about putting your application together, is recruiting for and setting up a meeting. So meetings don't have to be group meetings. They can be one-to-one, they can be over the telephone. There are a huge kind of variety of ways in which you can involve people. You can go into community and you can do community engagement work to engage with people in that kind of environment and then talk about your project. So this is just to give you a bit of a taster, really. One of the first things that can be useful to do is to consider where you might identify people who would bring valuable perspectives and be able to contribute to your research meaningfully. So reaching out to existing groups, so community groups, can be a really good way of engaging with a range of people. Patient support groups, for example, or charities often have mailing lists, or they may already have PPI groups that are kind of directly related to the broad topic area that you're working in. We have a database at the RSS in Southampton, so we have kind of an email list of people who are interested in patient and public involvement. I haven't got it on my slide, but we do also have our own PPI group, so a kind of generic PPI group, I guess you would call them, but for studies that perhaps are at a population level, so aren't condition specific, this group is kind of brought together to support on those, because sometimes it can be a little bit harder to identify people without a particular lived experience or a particular condition to hang that search off of. There's also a really great website called People in Research. So the website address is here, and essentially you can go on to People in Research and there's the kind of landing page says I'm a researcher or I'm a public contributor, and you can click that you're a researcher and you can upload an advert about your research and the patient and public involvement representatives that you're looking for. And then those people that are interested in contributing will be able to kind of see all of the different adverts nationally for different PPI opportunities. If you're clinical, it's fine to reach out to individuals in a clinical setting. So you could kind of get some leaflets printed and give them out to patients and things like that. And kind of, you'd obviously need to think about how you would do that in a way that was appropriate with your role. But from an ethics point of view, from a research ethics point of view, that's fine. You would want to ensure that you're providing a really clear overview of the project, the details of the role that you're asking people to fulfill, the payment that you'll be offering, so that people really do know what they're getting themselves in for when you're inviting them. And then you'd need to decide on some of the practicalities, like whether it's going to be in the community or face-to-face, etc. When you're actually running a session with PPI contributors, so I'm assuming that you maybe are running a group session here and you've got, say, 4 to 5 individuals, either face-to-face or online, and you're having some kind of broad discussions about your research application and some of the questions that you have about perhaps barriers to recruitment, for example. It's useful to have a rough agenda with some areas, but also allow for flexibility, because people will often bring things up that you haven't considered, and that's one of the real strengths of patient and public involvement, to highlight areas or issues that you actually haven't considered. It's really important to use plain English and to be really clear about roles and expectations, so that everybody understands kind of why they're there, what their role is, but also you can kind of communicate meaningfully with people. It is important to have really good facilitation skills, and I think this is particularly true if you're running a group session, making sure that the quieter members of the group are getting an opportunity to talk, making sure that people feel kind of empowered and confident to share their views. You'll need to think about if anybody would be taking notes. It's worth noting that unlike research, it's not necessarily important for everything in those sessions to be captured. You certainly don't need to be capturing what people are saying verbatim. You don't need to be recording. It's more about capturing the key feedback and the key ideas that people are sharing, so that you can then incorporate that into your study design. And your initial meeting that you're having to develop your grant application can be used as a starting point for future collaborations. So that's a conversation that you can have in the session, which can be a really nice way to end and then think about next steps. Staying on the theme of pre-grant PPI, and this is a copy of the research cycle, which helps us to think about all of the ways in which, or not all of the ways, but a number of ways in which patient and public involvement representatives can be involved and embedded throughout the whole of the research process. We, at this stage, so when you're developing your grant application, you're really thinking about the design and the development of the grant proposal, probably the previous section as well. So the identification and the prioritization may come if you're in the very, very early stages and you haven't quite worked out a research question yet. But the focus will be on the design and the development of the grant application. And there's a huge number of ways in which people can be involved in this process. Clarifying the research question and its importance, ensuring the methods are appropriate, creating recruitment strategy, working with you to think about your ethics and things like that, planning for your future patient and public involvement and what their role can be throughout the course of the project. So yeah, there's a wide number of ways in which patient and public involvement members should be involved at this stage. And there will be, within an NIHR application form, there will be a requirement that you are able to, in detail, talk about some of the ways in which your patient and public involvement representatives have supported. So I'm aware that many of you will be applying for NIHR kind of grant funding. There will obviously be some of you who are applying for other funding streams, and they will have their own requirements, but broadly speaking, the principles will be quite similar. You'll just need to have a little look and see exactly what it is that they're requiring. But I'll do a little bit of a detailed discussion about some of the NIHR standard application form requirements. So depending on the funding stream, there's normally a stage one and an outline actually, and a full submission. Within the outline or the stage one, you will be asked to submit a detailed research plan, which is 5 pages. And this is to include information about working in partnership by those affected by your research. And so what you would need to do is really embed some of the details and information about your PPI work into that research plan. You'll also be required to submit a plain English summary. And that's something that you can work on in collaboration with your PPI members. And you should also reference in that some of the PPI work that you have done, so that is included within your plain English summary. If you're then invited to submit a full stage application, you will need to submit a detailed research plan, which is 15 pages. And this will, again, need to include a section on working in partnership, and include a section called Working in Partnership with Those Affected by Your Research. And again, this is your opportunity to embed information about your PPI activities and other kind of broader stakeholder work. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that in a minute. In that section, you will also need to submit the plain English summary as you did in the outline. In addition to these 2 sections, you will also have a people and communities section, which will be 3,500 characters. And this is an opportunity for you to go into a lot more detail about your the patient and public involvement work that you've done, the impact that it has had on the grant application, and your future plans. So just to provide a little bit more information, and I won't spend too much time on this, but the detailed research plan, which is a different length depending on the funding stream and the stage, you will need to describe how you work with people and communities in more details, and this should be embedded throughout the research plan and throughout your methodology. So, for example, you can kind of, if you have work packages, for example, within each of the work packages, you could put a bit of information about your plans for patient and public involvement in that work package. You'd need to include who has shaped this proposal so far and why and how. So in terms of embedding this, it would be about identifying how feedback has had an impact on the proposed methodology when you describe the methods, who's going to be involved throughout and how. So all of information on PPI does need to be included in this section. In terms of the standalone people and communities section, this is really an opportunity for you to go into a huge amount more detail about the patient and public involvement work that you've done. And so this should include things like a summary of patient and public involvement representatives, their experience and background, how they have contributed, the contributions they've made, and really importantly, the impact that it has had on your application. Being able to demonstrate that impact from feedback to whatever it might be, change in recruitment approaches or change in methodologies, whatever it might be, is really, really important and shows that kind of meaningful input. You'll also need to include a really clear overview of your plans for involvement going forward should your project be funded. So exactly who is going to be involved, what their roles are going to be, and anything that you need to consider, such as training, support, mentorship, things like that, as well as making sure you consider payment for patient representatives. So talking about payment, you will be expected to ensure that your PPI work has been costed into your applications, and your funding body, the review panel, will look at your costings and cross-check with the activities to make sure that it all lines up. There are no set guidelines on costs as such, but there are kind of broad recommendations. There's something called a cost calculator. So if you were to Google PPI cost calculator NIHR, you will find a resource which allows you to kind of input some of the activities that you're doing in it, input the costs that are associated with those, and it will kind of help you think about all of the different things that you need to consider and come up with a broad overview of the costs. You do need to be pragmatic, so you do need to ensure that it's value for money and you're able to deliver on it, but also I wouldn't shy away from adequately costing your patient and public involvement work, because it is a really important aspect of the research study, and a panel will come back to you and say that you haven't put enough money aside for it if they think that you haven't. In terms of broad guidelines, the kind of general recommendation is £25 per hour for time. You'd also need to consider things like travel expenses and parking, venue hire. If you're working with people who don't speak English, you might need to consider translation services or interpreters. If you're thinking about your ongoing PPI work and working with the same people over the course of the project, it may be that there's some additional courses or formal training that you would like them to do in order to be able to fulfill that role. Ultimately, it's really difficult to kind of put a broad number on costing for PPI and what that looks like, because every single project will be different. What you really need to do is have a really clear plan of what your PPI members will be doing to support your project and kind of work backwards from that. So you outline your activity and then you work out the cost of each of those activities, and the cost associated with the work that you're asking them to do. Pre-grant, your PPI activity should be funded as well. Obviously, there's that can be challenging for some people, because if you're relying on the grant to fund the work, which you are, there may not be the funds available to to pay your PPI representatives before you've been awarded that grant. It's worth looking into, so whether if you're part of a university or department or your organisation, whether there's some internal funds there that could support this. Alternatively, RSSs do have access to a small budget which researchers can apply to for funding for patient and public involvement. So if you are working with an RSS hub, ask them about funding pre-grant PPI work, and they will be able to help you to apply for that funding. Within an NIHR study, there is normally a requirement for a nominated PPI lead. So this is an individual who is designated as leading on any PPI activity that's planned. This really is to ensure accountability for the work that has been proposed and to ensure that there's kind of adequate support for PPI members who are involved in the study. Normally, it's a member of the research team. It can kind of be anybody, I guess, within the research team who has the kind of broad skill set, so comfortable working with people, organisation, things like that, and enough of a kind of insight into the project to be able to sort of meaningfully guide conversation to help shape the project. It could be the PI, it could be somebody else within the team who's been nominated. In some cases, it can be a PPI member. So, for example, if you've got a PPI co-applicant, it may be that it's appropriate for them, given their individual skill set, to be the PPI lead. Again, it will depend on who's in your team, what your PPI members are like, what your project's about. So there are a lot of variables to consider. And again, I've mentioned this previously, but charities can support the broad delivery of PPI within the delivery of a study. In terms of support available, so I'm from Southampton and Partners Hub, so I'm sort of speaking to the support that we're able to provide here, but there are a number of RSSs across the country, and the support that we offer is largely quite similar. So in Southampton, we are able to work with researchers and research teams, so we'll offer one-to-one meetings to discuss your research plan, or your grant application, and talk about your patient and public involvement, and kind of make recommendations and have a little think with you about some of the ideas that might be suitable for your particular project. We have the PEER, the Public Involvement and Engagement Resource, so that's the funding that I spoke about a moment ago. So you can apply for that to pay for your PPI members' time. We can do e-reviews, so we can review drafts of your application. And if you would like, we can support with the actual facilitation of some of the pre-grant PPI activities. So if you've got an online or in-person session and you wanted some help perhaps facilitating the first one just to get you going, we can have a little look and see whether we're available and come along to that potentially. Just to go into a tiny bit more detail about the PEER. So in Southampton, you can apply for up to £350. It is kind of part of a package of support, so it's not a kind of standalone kind of funding stream that you can just apply for externally. You do need to have signed up to our database and be receiving support from us as an organisation. So we would normally have a one-to-one to talk through what your plans are with the PEER before you went in and put in an application. It saves your time and it saves our time. Just make sure that the proposed work within the PEER grant applications are in line with what we would expect that funding pot to fund. There's a application form and guidance notes, and once you submit to us, we try and get a decision back to you within 2 weeks. And here's just a little infographic, but it just will give you a bit more information about that process if you were interested in applying for funding, and there's quite a bit more detail on there.